Hello. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to my little video series I call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases, so I've decided to make videos about it. If you like true crime, and also want to feel better about your makeup skills, because I don't know what I'm doing, you should totally subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yeah, how's it going? Hope everything's going well for y'all. And I hope you all are ready for the case that we're going to get into, all right? So I've decided to break this case up into 4 parts, and it is kind of like with last week's about Crystal Rogers. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this case. Now, even though this case is officially solved and closed, there are many out there who think that it should be reopened because of the lingering questions and, as we'll get into, questionable behavior, to say the least, of some of the lead detectives in this case. It's just a wild one today. There's also a book about this case that I read. You know I love cases with books. I read The Saving Stacy, The Untold Story of the Moody Massacre by Rob St. Clair. Now, we'll get into it. Rob here was an attorney that was related to this case. Don't want to give out too much just yet, but we will get there. But yeah, so I went ahead and read this book, which, like with most of these books, I did appreciate that it filled in a lot of intimate details about the victims in today's case, the backstory, and a lot of the shady shit that went on with this investigation, all right? So yeah, we'll talk about this book towards the end, but yeah, this is the one that I read, and I was really glad that there was a book on this case because I can tell you there's little to no information about this case, really, you know? Nothing with really concrete answers or anything like that, so I was really happy to find out that there was a book written about this case. And as always, I love to give little shout outs to people who have pointed me in the direction of this case. So thank you too much to Smash the Bug for throwing this case my way. You also said in your comment there wasn't a lot of coverage about this case, and I can totally see why. There's just not a lot of information out there if you don't get the book. And it was just, yeah, it's really mind-boggling, this case, man. Whenever I go into cases, right, especially where there's cases where there's lingering questions or doubts, or people are just scratching their heads wondering if all the answers and everything about the case has come out. I always go into those kind of cases with a little bit of skepticism, right? Because I don't want to go too conspiracy theory overboard or anything. I always try to come into these cases with an objective viewpoint, even if I know the general point by point of the case, who did what and whatnot. I always try to come at it with an objective viewpoint, be like, all right, let me read how this story unfolded, what do I think, and all that good stuff. And man, I will tell you, I went into this case with, as much of an objective / skepticism as I could. And yeah, they've convinced me, all right? Through my research and the book, it's convinced me that we may not know what really happened in today's case. Today, we will be talking about the case of Scott Moody and the Moody Massacre. Have you heard of this one? I gotta say, I hadn't heard about this one. So again, thank you, Smash the Bug, for pointing me in the direction of this case. And just a quick forewarning for all 4 of the videos that will be about this case. There's going to be, talk of, crime scene stuff. We'll be talking about, wounds and stuff like that. So we're getting a little bit into graphic detail. There is cussing. There will also be talk of sexual assault of a minor that will be forthcoming in other videos. But yeah, just forewarned, there's a lot of heavy adult themes in this case. And yeah, there's a lot to get into, so I'm just gonna hop right in and we'll start talking about this case, starting with the main person of interest in this case, Scott Moody and his family, all right? So yeah, as per usual in part 1, we're going through a lot of backstory, who everyone in this case is. We will talk about the awful, awful massacre that happens in this case. And we will end with the beginnings of the investigation. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So Scott Robert Moody was born August 12th, 1986 in Bellefontaine, Ohio. His parents were Stephen R. Moody and Sheri Kay Shafer. She went by Kay. Scott also had a younger sister named Stacy Moody, and she was born on September 14th, 1989. Now, Steve Moody was a local farm boy, and Kay, Kay, who was also a town local and whose family also ran a farm, met in 1985 when Kay was just 17 years old and Steve was only 20. They met at the Logan County Fair, and much against Kay's mother and grandmother's wishes, the two got married shortly thereafter. They would actually marry in August of that same year that they met, 1985, only 12 months before their son Scott would be born. And as I just said, Stacy would come along 3 years later. Now, Kay's family owned Shaker Farms, which spanned 475 acres west of Bellefontaine, and it included 11 parcels of land, as well as like residential properties and stuff. The family owned a lot of local properties and rented properties out and stuff, as well as renting a farm. Now, the family raised and milked shorthorn dairy cattle, and the cattle were even shown at the Logan County and Ohio State fairs. Now, the farm had been in the Shafer family for a few generations at this point, and when Kay met and married Steve, the farm was being run by Kay's grandmother, Wilma F. Buroker, who, as I just stated, was really against her granddaughter's marriage. Wilma just thought her granddaughter was just kind of too young and immature for marriage, Kay was 17, like I said. She kind of exhibited sort of like that stereotypical teenage behavior that you would expect from a rural farm town. She, liked to party and stay out late. She would apply for like menial jobs, but then like quit after only a few weeks because she didn't like it or it was too hard or whatever. She liked, date around and just kind of exhibited sort of that stereotypical 17-year-old behavior, right? Which is probably why Wilma thought she was just a little too young and irresponsible to marry right now, right? Which, I feel like Wilma's not exactly wrong here. Now, though Wilma was against Kay's marriage, she still provided a home for Kay and her new husband, Like, it was still her family and her granddaughter, and she did want the marriage to work out. So she allowed Kay and Steve to live with her in her large, roomy farmhouse. Now, when Scott and Stacy came along, Wilma decided it was best for the family to move to their own home, so she provided them a little bit smaller farmhouse, but still a pretty big, roomy one. On the farm, remember, I just said the family owned lots of properties, the farm was super large, and they had lots of like farmhouses and other properties that they rented out. So Wilma provided, one of these properties for her granddaughter and her children. Wilma was really hoping that the couple having their own home would kind of help with the problems they were having. Big shock, the couple was fighting a lot. They just were not getting along. They had 2 small children now, and Wilma just thought, well, maybe having their own place will help resolve some of these issues, Now, Kay's parents, so Scott and Stacy's grandparents, Gary Dwayne and Sharyl Sue Shafer, lived just a half a mile from their daughter and her family in their own farmhouse. But unfortunately, switching locations did not really help the couple. And in March of 1990, after giving birth to Stacy only 6 months prior, Kay filed for divorce from Steve. And whoo boy, Kay and Steve ended up in a bitter, contentious, very infamous divorce. Yeah, so Logan County, all right, Bellefontaine, it's, small rural farming area, and as such, word gets around, right? Everyone knows everyone, so stuff spreads pretty quickly. And yeah, everyone knew about the Moody divorce. It was pretty well known around town. This divorce and subsequent custody battle would end up lasting for years, guys. Allegations of neglect and abuse were made on both sides. Public screaming matches were very commonplace. Probably hence the infamy of the divorce. And each party accused the other of being an unfit parent. Now, all these allegations were, of course, investigated by the court, and the court referee ultimately recommended that Steve and Kay share custody. Yeah, that's gonna go lovely. The referee concluded in the report that the former couple both shared a, quote, disposition towards physical violence and a considerable amount of pain and anger to deal with. Now, throughout this, really difficult, turbulent time, it is said that Steve and Kay did try to make the relationship work. They really did try. They tried reconciling. They tried just separating for a while. They tried dating again. They even tried marriage counseling, but it just wasn't going to work. At one point, even their local pastor who had been counseling them pretty much told them that, you know what, you guys are better off without each other. This just isn't going to work. It's not a healthy relationship. And it's like, like, damn, dude, that's how you know, like, it's really not good when, like, the marriage counselor, the person who's supposed to be, like, counseling the relationship to stay together is like, yeah, no, this ain't gonna work. You're better off apart. And that's just how it goes sometimes, you know? Some people are just better apart, you know? Meanwhile, Kay had to adjust to a brand new life, right? Remember, she's still very young. She only had her first kid, like, when she was, 17, 18? And then Stacy only 3 years later. So, you know, she's still young. And like with most young people, she wanted to go out and enjoy herself. But, you know, she had 2 small children now. So, you know, if she did want to party, she, you know, had to find a babysitter. And yeah, it was just more difficult. She also found it a little difficult when she could hang out with anyone. She didn't like being around her high school friends at this point. Most of them either talked about college or their upcoming marriages. And she also felt like she didn't fit in at church either. So Kay didn't really have a lot of friends to, like, party with. So she ended up partying on her own and getting involved in a string of casual relationships. One relationship that Kay thought would be casual would turn into anything but when she started dating John Martin, who was 44 years old. John was a local farmer who actually leased property from Wilma. John would end up moving in with Kay, Scott, and Stacy not too long after the two started seeing each other. And it is said that Steve was embarrassed by this. This was kind of right after the official separation. And because it's a small town and everyone knows everyone, you know, Steve, it is said, just kind of felt embarrassed by this. And it is said Kay just relished this. She loved getting under Steve's skin, loved getting back at him, as we'll get into further. But eventually, John would end up moving out and breaking up with Kay, citing her increasingly erratic behavior. Kay and John were together for 2 years. So let's get just a tiny bit into this erratic behavior that John described. So it is said not long after moving in with Kay, Scott, and Stacy, Kay grew suspicious of John's dealings with Scott. But rather than confront John, kick him out, or anything, Kay instead went to the Logan County Children's Services and filed the first of what would be many allegations, always alleging some kind of abuse against her children. And Child Services, who would soon learned to know who Kay was, would usually always follow up with Kay's complaints with a letter that generally always said, quote, "Dear Sheri, for your information, we saw and spoke with Scott about a report that John Martin had hit the child. We found no evidence of abuse, nor do we intend to pursue the allegations further." So pretty much they would send the same kind of letters. It's yeah, we've investigated this. There's really nothing here. We're not pursuing this further. Move along. But even stranger, it wasn't just John who Kay would accuse of being inappropriate with her children, knowing full well the small town and community that they were in, knowing full well that court motions and stuff like that are of public record. Kay filed numerous motions with the court accusing Steve of sexually abusing their children, and she would claim to have the medical records to back it up. Yeah. Kay is already kind of hate to say it, but kind of a flake. I can't abide by people making false accusations, specifically when it talks about sexual abuse. That shit pisses me off. Sexual assault victims already don't get taken seriously. Allegations already don't get investigated or taken seriously or anything. And when you have these false accusations that Kay is throwing out, it just makes it that much harder for victims to be heard and listened to, you know? So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, when I read that, I was no, girl, this is not the way to go about it. You're not being a very good mother right here. Kay's attorney claimed that they could document the dozens of times that Kay had taken her children to the ER, to be examined. But though Kay would continuously file these motions and allegations and complaints that always alleged some kind of abuse or misconduct by others, the responses were pretty much the same. They would usually go along the lines of, quote, "Dear Miss Moody, in response to your phone contact this date, emergency removal of the children in Steve's custody during his visitation has to go through the courts or through law enforcement." She was pretty much trying to use the law and any means that she could to get back at Steve. You know what I mean? I think we've all known parents like this, in my personal opinion, just because I have a little bit of personal experience with this kind of thing. just FYI, like, I think these parents are not that great. Like, when you have a child, I don't care what, like, bullshit you have with the child's other parent. You need to make it work for that child. You know, not saying staying together, but, you know, make parenting, co-parenting, whatever that entails, work. And the stuff that Kay is doing and that we'll get into is just, it's not cool, dude. Like, it's not cool at all. Kay's lawyer, Lawrence Henke? Henke. Do you think it's like Henke? Whatever. Kay's lawyer initially represented her in the divorce, but he eventually fired Kay as a client for her increasingly hostile, erratic behavior. When she received the letter from her lawyer pretty much firing her, I guess she called him up and yelled at him, quote, "You had better get off your ass and start working for us instead of Mr. Moody," and then she like hung up on him before he could respond. She believed that her lawyer had sold her out to Steve. Yeah, man, yeah. She definitely has some issues that she's working through here. Finally, on May 2nd, 1991, after all the motions and allegations and complaints had been waded through, the court finally started to hear the other motions and get the process of finalizing the divorce. Remember, Kay had filed for divorce in March of 1990, and now we're in May of 1991, and they're just now getting to the process of finalizing the divorce because of all these, like, allegations and the back and forth between Steve and Kay. And the divorce wouldn't be finalized and signed by a judge until August 31st, 1992. So still over a year before this divorce would be finalized. But that was just the divorce. There was still the custody to go through. Now, according to the then director of Children's Services, John Holtkamp, quote, "That doesn't mean it didn't continue to be a very difficult time for these children. The divorce case file includes a notation that Sheri Kay was overly dependent on her family." And we'll dive a little bit into that later on. Now, Kay, in true, I'm gonna say it, bad parent fashion, did everything she could to sabotage Scott and Stacy's relationship with their father. I'm not down with that. I don't care what you have going on. You don't sit there and trash the children's parent in front of them. That's just, nah, dude, not cool. And that's what Kay did. She would continuously talk smack about Steve around the children, and as we'll get into, did everything she could to undermine the relationship. On top of, you know, smack talking Steve whenever she could, she also did everything she could to avoid giving Steve his visitation rights. Yeah, he had visitation rights every other weekend, and I believe like every Wednesday. And she just did everything in her power to prevent these visitations. One time she told Steve that like, oh, they can't come over because Scott has pink eye, and the doctor said that like he can't go anywhere or whatever. Even though, again, this was the weekend, you know, Steve's visitation, Monday Scott showed up to school completely fine. And she never produced a doctor's note or medical records about Scott supposedly having pink eye. In early 1993, Kay attempted to file criminal charges against Steve for sexual abuse against Stacy, who was then 3 years old. Once again, Child Services pretty much told Kay to pound sand. They told her the charges would be dropped and they wouldn't be filed unless she produced actual evidence. Or if Stacy herself had made the allegations, you know, I think they had just had it with Kay's shenanigans, and honestly, I don't blame them. Like, I'm sorry, dude, like, I really don't like Kay here. I just think she's being, I mean, big shock. She had her first kid when she was like 18. Of course she's immature and dumb, but like, nah, dude, you can't be using stuff like this for your own, like, benefit or whatever because you want to get revenge or whatever. Like, screw you, Kay. Don't ever make false allegations of sexual abuse. That is so not okay. Now, a few months after this, Steve was still having trouble getting his court-appointed visitation, and he even contacted Child Services himself to, you know, see if they could help him out at all. Child Services did write a letter to the judge who was overseeing the Moody custody case, and did tell him that Kay was preventing the children from seeing their father. And eventually, Steve did get his court-appointed visitation. Kay did not want her children to have any relationship with the Moody family at all. Steve's parents, so Scott and Stacy's grandparents, even accused Kay of keeping their own grandchildren away from them. In June of 1993, Joan Moody, Steve's mother, wrote a letter to the Logan County Domestic Relations Court judge, and they wanted the court's help in seeing their grandchildren. Joan wrote in a letter to the court, quote, "Please, judge, can you do something? We are trustworthy, honest people whose only desire is to build a healthy, wholesome relationship with our grandchildren." So as all of this is working its way through the courts and all that, right? The custody battle and all that stuff, allegations, all that stuff. Kay was still attempting to adjust to her new life. Since child support didn't go very far, Kay had to find a job. But since she was uneducated, she just took like menial jobs. But, as she had done when she was a teenager, she would just like quit these jobs within a week or two. But she did finally manage to land a job that paid above minimum wage. And this was at the Ohio Department of Transportation. So that's good. She's getting a job, it's above minimum wage, so she can, help care for her children. But get this. Just as things were starting to go on the upturn for Kay, she was in a horrible car crash. In this car crash, she separated her shoulder, and this injury would leave her with long-term chronic pain for the rest of her life. And it forced her, at least temporarily, to go on disability. So that really sucked. I really felt for her there. Like, that really sucks, dude. Chronic pain is so awful. I would never wish it on my worst enemy. Well, maybe I would. And, if she finally gets a job that, like, pays above minimum wage, and then, boom, in a car accident that leaves her with chronic pain. However, when Kay did return to work, she didn't seem like the best employee or coworker. Her evaluations held a string of unsatisfactory remarks. Quote, I do not feel Sheri's doing the amount of work I expect of her. She has in the past refused to do a job, mowing, I asked her to do. In some of her other jobs, she tends to stand around and let other people do the job for her. In regards to team effort and cooperation, her evaluation read, quote, Sheri is not getting along with some of our people because of her refusal to do a job and the fact that she does not jump in and help on many of her other jobs. I receive many complaints often about her cooperation. I counsel her after she refused to mow and she took an extended lunch. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've all had those coworkers, right? Like, Kay, that they don't lift a finger, and like you're wondering, like, how is this person still here? Why are they not fired yet? Seems to be the kind of employee that Kay was. And like, look, you might say, well, she had like shoulder pain and stuff. And like, look, I get that, but just because you have chronic pain or like your shoulders mess up, that doesn't mean you can't like help out with the coworkers with whatever you can do, right? Like, people are pretty receptive to that, they know that you have limitations or whatever, and if you just put in the effort to do your job and help, most of the time people are willing to come in and help you out, right? But yeah, according to these valuations, Kay just sort of sat around and did nothing. Now, interestingly enough, on one occasion, Kay filed her own response to these unsatisfactory evaluations. Quote, I have a problem with this because I believe he is basing this evaluation on hearsay, not on what he has witnessed for himself. She went on and on defending herself. She was always a victim. She was never guilty of anything. It was always someone else's fault. One paragraph read, quote, I was assigned to mow at State Route 68 and 508. In the past, I had an altercation with an ex-employee's wife who has threatened me with bodily harm if I was ever seen near her husband or her home. At the time, I had notified my superiors of the situation and was informed by them if I felt threatened or afraid if asked to work in the mentioned area, I was to say something about it and I would not be held in disfavor. And what about the other things, Kay? Notice how she like goes on this one specific instance of like this one specific route they wanted her to mow. That's fine. But according to these evaluations, this was just a pattern and a string of behavior from hers. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things. It's like, dude, if you were actually like putting in effort and trying to do your job and stuff, like I guarantee you they wouldn't have any problem with you like not mowing that specific route. But when you're insubordinate, when coworkers are complaining about you because they're tired of picking up your slack. Yeah, dude, like you don't get breaks like that really. You know what I mean? So I just thought it was really funny that she marked this one instance when, her evaluations had a string of other incidents that didn't have to do with this particular route. Then, dude, I kind of feel sorry for Kay, dude. It just keeps coming for her. In December of 1994, she was rear-ended hard in another gnarly car accident. And she returned to the ER with even more shoulder pain. She was eventually diagnosed with soft tissue injury, with cervical strain or strain to her neck. And she would end up seeing a neurosurgeon from January to March of 1995. Like, yeah, man, like regardless if she's a shitty employee, like that sucks. That really sucks. Now, even though she successfully sued to get her medical costs covered, Kay ended up falling into the trap that so many people do, especially after a gnarly injury. She ended up with an addiction to pain meds. And when the doctors cut her off, she discovered she could actually find drugs elsewhere. And she began a drug addiction that included a string of casual relationships with men coming and going all throughout her life. Meanwhile, Steve eventually remarried a woman named Audrey, Audrey, who had 2 children of her own, 18-year-old Crystal and 16-year-old Nicole Nikki Vegetes, who would end up growing up with 4 young children of her own. At the time of the events of today's case, Nikki was 29 years old and lived with her boyfriend Jeff Kuderman. Now, I'm not sure how long they were together, but Steve and Audrey had started seeing each other like during the nasty like contentious divorce before it was finalized, and they were kind of going through that. It was around that time period that Steve and Audrey got together, and to celebrate the divorce finally being finalized, Steve married Audrey in September of 1992. They would end up having 3 children of their own, Scott and Stacy's half-brothers, Steve R. Moody, Christopher R. Moody, and Adam R. Moody. Now, the whole blended Moody family, including Nikki, ended up living in DeGraff, Ohio. And it is said Scott and Stacy, did grow pretty close to their, new blended family, much to Kay's dislike. She was still very bitter and angry at Steve, it is said, and was, kind of bitter and pissed that he seemingly moved on. Which, again, it's like, dude, I'm sorry, but, you need to get over your issues, especially when you have children with this person, sorry, not sorry, Kay needs to get over her issues, right? As we've discussed before, Kay continued to make Steve's visitation absolutely difficult. He had to scrape and claw to get his court-appointed visitation because Kay would do everything to undermine it. This bitterness seemed to last until at least 1999, when Kay sought a change to the custody order, reducing Steve's visitation even more because she claimed she didn't want it to interfere with the kids' extracurricular activities. Okay, Kay, whatever. I'm sorry. I know emotions can run high with divorces, especially, if the spouse moves on, right? Because they're this weird, competition, right? Who's gonna move on first? But it's dude, I'm sorry, at some point, you need to grow the F up and realize that you have children involved here, and so you need to get over your issues. To make matters worse and more stressful for Kay, as this was going on with the custody and everything, Kay's family farm, which was at one point valued at $1.44 million, other sources said that it was valued at $850,000, was tied up in an estate battle because Wilma, remember, Kay's grandmother, Scott and Stacy's great-grandmother, wrote a bad will shortly before she passed away, which was in July of 1995. Now, from the beginning, right after Wilma died, right after, there was a lot of fighting in the family about what to do with her property and assets. So in the will, filed with the Logan County Common Pleas Court, Wilma gave a portion of her property to her daughter and son-in-law, Gary and Sharyl Shafer, Scott's grandparents, her granddaughter Kay, and her great-grandchildren, Scott and Stacy. And she did this so they'd all have somewhere to live. Now, the family legend went that Wilma wanted to ensure that this farm would be in the family for generations to come. And it is why she wrote and divided the will the way that she did, which we will get into. So, Wilma wanted to ensure that neither her daughter Sharyl or granddaughter Kay would be able to sell the farmland. She wanted the farm to, stay in the family, man. Right? It had already been in the family for, I think a couple generations at that point, and she wanted to ensure that it would stay in the family. And it is said Wilma didn't really trust her daughter or granddaughter, albeit for different reasons. She didn't trust Sharyl because, she thought Sharyl was just kind of naive, easily taken advantage of. She was pretty gullible. And she, didn't trust Kay at all because she thought Kay had just made, bad life decision after bad life decision. This may have been when Kay was struggling with her opioid addiction as well, so that didn't help. And it is said, all right, so the family legend goes that she also thought Kay having more than one child was a bad life decision. So rumor has it that Wilma had actually pressured Sharyl to only have one child. And this was so there was no sibling rivalries when it came to an inheritance and the farm property and inheriting the land. And according to Wilma, she thought, this would ensure that each generation could prosper while leaving something for the future generation to also prosper from. I don't know, I just thought that was kind of interesting. What do you guys think about that perspective? I just thought that was super interesting. But considering how old Wilma was, she lived through the Great Depression, I would imagine. I think I have my timeline right. So yeah, maybe it had something to do with that. Just thought it was super interesting. So after Wilma's death, the probate court said that the will was very poorly drafted and poorly worded, and they confused it. A probate judge actually called it the weirdest, most confusing will in the history of Logan County. It contained complicated life estates, tried to establish some sort of charitable foundation, it was like some sort of agricultural scholarship, and it was to recognize Wilma's parents, Wilma and her husband, and their daughter Sharyl. She called it the Fusen Buroker Memorial. I think Fusen might have been her maiden name, and she wanted to award annual scholarships in the names of herself, her husband, her parents, and her daughter. The will also requested that the court appoint trustees to ensure that Wilma's last wishes were adhered to. Now, in doing all this, Wilma assumed that if she used life estates as like the inheritance, she would be able to like at least indirectly control the family farm for the next few generations because she didn't trust her daughter or granddaughter. So Wilma's father, all the way back in 1937, had done a pretty simple will, all right? He left everything to his wife for the, quote, full term of her natural life. And after her death, everything would be passed on to their daughter, Wilma. And this is exactly what Wilma wanted to do with her will. She just needed to, make it all official and all that. So she enlisted the help of attorney Howard Trawl II, who did recommend to Wilma some fundamental changes to the will, some very important stuff. But Wilma, just knows everything, didn't want to listen to the attorney, and shocker, ended up a huge mess. So in her will, Wilma left $3,000 each to Kay, Scott, and Stacy. This money was to be held in a trust run by Sharyl, and it was to be used for higher education purposes only. She also left $3,000 to her local church. The will also stipulated that all livestock, machinery, equipment, crops, either growing or stored, jewelry, household goods, furnishings, including silver, and the, quote, car that I am driving at the time of my death would all go to her daughter Sharyl. And that left the remainder of the estate that included the family farm of 475 acres, along with the other parcels of real estate, and this all together had a total worth of approximately $2 million. So Wilma was determined to pass half of the family farm onto her family, hence ensuring that it was in the family for a few generations. And the other half she wanted to be sold in order to establish her foundation / scholarships. Now, the will left the half of the family farm that was to stay in the family to Sharyl. However, it was only given to Sharyl under a life estate. This meant that Sharyl could never sell or give the land / property to anyone else. Upon Sheryl's death, the life estate would then pass on to Kay, again, as a life estate. And upon Kay's death, the life estate would then be transferred to Scott and Stacy, and they would inherit it, quote, free and clear to share and share alike. The legal term to share and share alike apparently meant that Scott and Stacy would each receive 1/2 of their mother's interest, or 1/4 of the family farm each. However, apparently Wilma's will omitted the phrase, or to the survivor of them. Because when she made her will, she didn't think that this was necessary. Remember, Scott was 9 or 10, Stacy's even younger than that. She figured if anything ever happened to Scott or Stacy, that child's family should receive something. And she figured by the time all of this would even be an issue, Scott and Stacy would be grown up with their own families and they'd draft their own will. Because again, remember, it was mainly Sharyl and Kay who Wilma did not trust. She probably didn't really have much thought to Scott and Stacy since they were her great-grandchildren and still young. So she probably figured if I can control the farm and keep it in the family for the next couple generations, prevent my daughter and granddaughter from selling it off, maybe my great-grandchildren will, further on the family tradition. That was, I'm wondering if that was sort of her thought process there. But as we will get into, there were things Wilma did not anticipate or even think about. So after the reading of her will after her death in 1995, her son-in-law, Gary, so, Kay's father, was apparently very offended and outraged that he had never owned the farm that he had worked so hard on for the last, several decades. After Gary and Sharyl had married, he had worked on the farm and tended to it and did a lot of work on it. And so, I don't know, I guess he was offended at the life estate thing, but again, it's what are you angry for? First of all, this wasn't even your land, brah. You married into this. Secondly, why do you want to sell the land? She just wanted to ensure that the land would stay in the family. I don't know how that would work with the life estate. Would they be able to to take out loans on the property or something. I don't know how that works. Maybe that's what he was upset about. Not sure. There wasn't like any nitty-gritty information, but yeah, Gary was apparently very pissed off that him and Sharyl did not own the land, really. You know what I mean? And so he threw a temper tantrum, got super pissed off, and decided, you know what? I'm just not going to work on the farm anymore. How about that? I'm just not going to tend to it as much. He was like, you know what? Cheryl's going to retire from her job as a school teacher. She can take care of it. Yeah, real mature attitude, right? And, you know, because of this, over the years, the farm and the properties began to degrade. Not only did Gary's not give a fuck attitude work against them, so too did Gary and Cheryl's ages. They just were not physically able to do a lot of the farm work anymore. And though the will had stipulated the foundation of that like agricultural scholarship or whatever, apparently the farm, for whatever reason, was not making enough money at that time in order to establish it. Sharyl was named executor of her mother's will, and she hired Troll, the attorney that Wilma had worked with, to help her, you know, figure all this out. And this is where I got kind of confused. Apparently Sharyl fell way behind on the overwhelming paperwork, like fell super behind. And this caused like way further issues and would end up costing tens of thousands of dollars for the family. So at one time, the 475 acres of land was valued at more than $2 million, right? Talked about that. However, disputes came up regarding the appraisals of the property for estate tax purposes. The original appraisal came in at only $834,110, less than the Logan County auditor had these properties assessed for taxation purposes. Yeah, I know when it comes to property appraisals, stuff can get real hinky real fast, and for some reason, Sharyl did not correct these issues, and I don't know why. Like, she had Troll there. Like, why not go to him and be like, dude, I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. Can you recommend me an attorney that can do this? Like, I'm confused on how she allowed this to happen, how Sharyl allowed everything to pile up when she went to an attorney to begin with. I don't know, man. It just said that Sharyl fell way, way behind on everything. And because she hadn't corrected, like, this appraisal discrepancy, she was late in filing the estate's Ohio estate tax return, which was required to be filed 9 months after Wilma's death. And because Sharyl did not file this appropriate paperwork or anything like that, this caused the family an extra $30,000 in just extra taxes and penalties and fees. Yeah. On top of all that, they had an additional $30,000 to pay now. And I don't get it, man. I don't get how Sharyl allowed that to happen. I don't know. I really don't. If, you know, she didn't have an attorney from the beginning, I could see that. Like, oh, she just, you know, maybe thought she could handle it, but, you know, ended up being too much for her. But she went to Troll, like, pretty much right from the beginning, because that was her mother's lawyer. And I don't know how this happened. How do you not go to the attorney and be like, help? Now, frustrated with her mother's failures and needing money, in January of 2001, Kay started researching all of her grandmother's properties. She wanted to get, like, a correct assessment, so she started looking at everything, trying to get a handle on all this. By this time, 2001, Kay, I think, had, like, cleaned up her act, at least, like, as far as, like, the opioid addiction. I couldn't find anything regarding, like, that she had a current drug addiction at the time of the events of today's case. So I think by this time, in January of 2001, she had gotten a handle on it. So that's good. Good for her. And also by this time, she had married a second time, a man named Stephen Wolf. She had started dating Stephen in 1996, and then the couple had married the next year in 1997. Now, Stephen had 2 children of his own, his daughter, 17-year-old Sarah, and his son, 16-year-old Stephen Wolf Jr. So yeah, by the way, because Kay married 2 men with the same name, Steve Moody, I'm going to refer to as Steve, and Stephen Wolf, Kay's second husband, Scott and Stacy's stepfather, I will refer to as Stephen to kind of keep it clear. Now, Stephen said that Scott and Stacy became very close to his children. Quote, they were here about a month ago, referring to a month before the events of today's case, all playing board games. Kay even grew close to Stephen's daughter, Sarah. On the back of her senior picture, she had written a message to Kay, and it read, quote, Mom, hey, I know that we don't see that much of each other, but I still love you. I'm sorry for everything that I've put you through. I love you, and I miss you so much. You always will be my mother, especially over my mom. I love you, L. Sarah. So that was Kay's update. And so she had gotten a second husband, seemed to have a really good relationship with her stepdaughter, so that's great. So in 2001, she was kind of tired of her mom's mom's BS, all right? And she was also, wanting her inheritance and wanting some of that money. So the next month in February 2001, Kay had contacted an attorney because she wanted someone to represent her interests in Wilma's estate in probate court. And she started doing her research on, legalese terms and property assessments, all that stuff. In the spring of 2002, she finally found an attorney in Terrence Flive. Flahive. How would you guys pronounce that? Flive? But anyway, he would end up representing Kay and, her interest in Wilma's estate in court. Kay apparently told people, quote, "It's time to finally do something if I ever want to see my money." So her lawyer wrote a letter to Sheryl's lawyer, Troll, asking why Sharyl had failed to file, some sort of account in a timely manner. She had to file this with the court, and she had failed to, submit it in time or something. And so, yeah, Kay's lawyer was asking, yo, what's up? Now, Troll said that Sharyl couldn't find certain monthly accounting statements and, get this, had made several deposits into the estate checking account, but couldn't remember the source of those deposits. I don't know, dude, Sharyl does not seem like she's the best person to handle this kind of thing, to put it mildly. In May of 2002, Kay then tried to get her mother removed from being the executor of Wilma's will, stating that she had failed to adequately adhere to Wilma's last wishes, had fallen behind on everything. So, she's trying to say she's forfeited her right to be executor of this estate. So while that was still pending, in September of 2003, Sharyl, as executor, then filed a complaint with the court seeking help in trying to get her mother's wishes fulfilled. I'm not sure why she didn't go to the court earlier. I don't know, man. There's some of this information that we just don't know. So I don't know why Sharyl wouldn't ask the court for help sooner. I don't know if it was Kay trying to get her removed or what, but it was just very bizarre to me. Why would you if you don't know what you're doing, why wouldn't you ask the courts for help? You have an attorney, why wouldn't you ask him for help? I was so confused. These are the questions I had. I just didn't know how Sharyl had allowed this to happen. Again, if she didn't have a lawyer, or other resources, I'd understand it, but she had a lawyer and all that, so I don't know, man. Now, several months after this, still frustrated with the lack of any progress in the estate or the case going on, Kay sent a to whom it may concern letter to the court. And, she pretty much was demanding to know, why had nothing been done? Assets had not been distributed. Nothing that Wilma had wanted done in her will had been done. And again, this was September 2003 is when Sharyl filed help with the court, and then it was several months later, so I don't know if we're getting to 2004 now, but dear God, we're almost 10 years after Wilma has died, and nothing had still been done that she wanted. That's pretty wild, right? In the letter, Kay was, pretty much stating everything that her mother had done and, failed to do, including Sharyl not paying federal or state taxes on the estate since Wilma's death. How do you go almost 10 years with paying no taxes on the estate? Do you people think that, taxes stop because, Wilma's dead? I was floored when I read that. I was like, what? That's so fucked up. Because now, guess what? If Sharyl and Gary die, guess who gets to deal with that? Kay. It's not right. And so, to be fair, I totally understand Kay's frustration here. And frankly, if Wilma thought her daughter wasn't really all that bright and was sort of gullible and naive, I'm not sure why she would be made executor of the will. I don't know if that's something the court appoints, or is that in the will? I'm not sure, but I don't know why Sharyl was picked. Other than, I guess, Wilma being her mother, but it's dude, maybe you should have a little bit more qualifications in that, or maybe there needs to be some sort of, help appointed, this shit is overwhelming. But yeah, not paying the taxes, that is no bueno. Kay said that her mother was, quote, not carrying full replacement insurance on the properties, does not repair or take care of the buildings on the properties, has failed to pay all real estate taxes, including more than $20,000 in back taxes, and has committed waste, neglecting the buildings, failing to plant crops, thereby forfeiting her life estate. Yeah, in this letter, Kay pretty much just wanted Sharyl out. I think she just wanted, and I'm not sure how this works, because I'd never even heard of life estates until this case, but I'm wondering if she was trying to get maybe Sheryl's life estate revoked and then she would have her life estate? I'm not sure. This stuff was wild when I was reading through it. I was like, what? A life estate? What the hell is that? I didn't know you could do that. I did not know that you could, like, pass on property, but, like, you know, if you get it, if it's a life estate, oh, well, you can't sell it or give it to anybody, though. That's wild. Now, by this time, all right, when Kay has sent this letter, as we've just discussed, right, we just went through the timeline. This has been going on for quite a few years, right? And throughout this time, Kay was often butting heads with her parents. Big shock. But it wasn't just about Wilma's estate and the back taxes and all that stuff. Gary and Sharyl were stuck in the olden times, and they had a more traditional approach to farming, which was not working out. And they absolutely refused to modernize the farm at all, as Kay wanted. But it seems, though there were pre-existing problems and a lot of drama before, it seems that the year 2003 is really when shit started to go south for the Shafer family. So Angel Wolf, Steven's sister, said that Kay told her that she didn't think her parents could handle farming anymore. They were behind on taxes, and that her parents would just refuse to do any modernization of the farm. And unfortunately, to top it all off, as all this was playing out, as you can guess, all of this stress and turmoil had an impact on Stephen and Kay's relationship, and they would end up divorcing in October of 2003. Yeah, I mean, not shocking, right? Like, if you have financial difficulties, family drama, and all this stuff, it creates tension and hostility in a relationship, you know, and that can strain it. Stephen did say that part of the reason him and Kay split was the financial difficulties. He said, quote, "This was partially due to the car accident, but Sheri Kay always had trouble holding on to a job. We were spending faster than we were making." Yeah, I'm guessing Kay lost her job at the Department of Transportation. That's what I'm gonna guess. In her 2004 federal tax form, Kay only listed $8,756 as her adjusted gross income, most of that coming from the farm. Now, neighbors who looked on and were kind of seeing all this from the outside described the family as, quote, quiet country folk, though they were well aware of, like, the financial difficulties that were besetting the family and had been a problem. One neighbor who sold the family hay lived across the street. His name was Joe Brenner, and he said, quote, "I sold them hay all the time. They seemed like decent people to me. I know they had financial troubles. There was a little stress there between the whole family, but maybe no more than normal." And all the while, the mounting tax bills were piling up. In fact, it was getting so bad that a county treasurer was actually threatening foreclosure on the farm. At this time, get this, guys, at this time, there had been about $56,000 in accumulated back taxes, fees, and penalties alone. Yeah, I don't know how Gary and Sharyl could think that this was okay to leave. Like, you're leaving a whole mess for your daughter. Do you not realize that? Like, I don't know, we're kind of dealing with this a little bit ourselves, where Jeff's parents are sitting on properties not paying taxes, and we're like, what are you doing? So he's been dealing with that. So I can definitely kind of get Kay's frustration here. Apparently, Gary and Sharyl had not paid any taxes at all on, like, the property or anything since 1997, guys. Yeah, we're in 2004 in this timeline right now. Since 1997, Gary and Sharyl sat on their ass and did not pay, like, the property taxes and all that other stuff that comes when you own property. At this point, much of the farm had been leased out to, like, other farmers, and then the Shafers had kept a small portion, you know, for themselves so that they could grow food for their livestock. Court auditor Dara Wren said, quote, "We were going to do a foreclosure, but we couldn't because the land was in an estate with a trustee." That trustee was Troll, who said that the family actually had recently, at the time of the events of today's case, had actually finally, like, agreed on something. They had worked out an agreement on how to, you know, do everything, and they, you know, were going to make it into, like, some, like, official agreement that was going to be finalized in the weeks after the events of today's case. He told the papers, quote, "It was somewhat a complicated will. They had decided how to divide it up amongst themselves." He said Kay and her parents, quote, "were getting along in the last year more than a number of years before that." So in early 2005, everyone had agreed to a resolution and had entered into an agreed judgment entry. And it was to distribute the assets of the estate in the following way. $375,000 would be set aside to establish the scholarship/foundation. They called it the Logan County Education Foundation, and it was to start no later than December 31st, 2007. And this required the sale of land, which, as we discussed, was Wilma's original original intention. A residential property in Bellefontaine was to be sold for no less than $50,000. The residential and farm property that consisted of 115 acres would be sold for no less than $300,000. Kay's home, where she lived with her children and consisted of 1 acre of land and a barn, would go on sale for no less than a minimum price of $90,000. And Kay had the first right of refusal to buy her home. She had until the 1st of April 2005 to make her decision. And yeah, by the way, in the end, when all was said and done, guys, get this, it would take 15 years after Wilma's death for everything to be settled. Which is why, when you draft a will, you should definitely listen to your lawyer. Could have avoided this, Wilma, if you had just listened to your attorney. Troll ended up telling the papers that foreclosure was actually very unlikely because the family had agreed to recently start selling off like parcels of land in order to pay the back taxes. They had actually sold one parcel of land about 6 to 8 weeks before the events of today's case, and they used that money to pay off the back taxes. Or I think they just paid off part of the back taxes with that sale. But either way, they started, chipping away at those back taxes. Kay had also been approved for a grant to fix some of the old failing farm equipment, such as the tractors. And she was planning on purchasing even more cows for their growing herd. Livestock dealer Melby Ober told of a phone call that he'd had with Kay on May 27th, 2005. And this is when she told him that she'd been approved for a grant. He said he had never heard her happier. And it seemed like the farm was poised for a comeback. They had even hired someone, a farmhand, to help around the farm starting around 2004, named Scott Young. And he worked on the farm for about a year before the events of today's case. So yeah, man, things are starting to look up. But though everything else seemed to be working out, the farm was poised for a comeback. It looked like they were finally going to settle this estate. Kay and Steven still had their own post-divorce issues to work out. Steven kept trying to get a hold of Kay to retrieve, I guess, some property and items that he had left at the home, as well as collect some money that he felt he was owed. But Kay had continued to, dodge him and ignore him. She had even gone to the sheriff's office to try to get a restraining order against Steven and, prevent him from contacting her, going into her home, or any of that. Don't think she got the restraining order. The relationship between Sarah, Steven's daughter, and Kay had also deteriorated at this point. Apparently, Sarah had seen a side of Kay that she was not a fan of. So after the divorce, Sarah, even though she had already graduated high school at this point, continued to live with Kay, Scott, and Stacy. But apparently it had gotten to a point where, Sarah had seen a side of Kay that she was not a fan of. In a letter to her former stepmother, Sarah had written, quote, "Kay, I'm just going to tell you that you have no fucking idea what you're doing to your own daughter, Stacy. She is laying in her bed crying and you expect me not to ask her what is wrong? That is fucking shallow. Since I came back, I have been through nothing but hell. Why don't you grow the hell up and face your problems like an adult? I don't care if you do get mad. Take care of your daughter, Sarah." Yeah, I do not know the context behind that. I couldn't find that, but damn. Things had definitely soured between mother and stepdaughter. And even though Kay herself had never really been much of a farmer, it seemed that her children sort of inherited that farming gene, especially Scott. He was an avid farmer, despite his hay allergies, and he continued the family tradition of showing the cattle and their livestock at the Logan County and Ohio State fairs. He had actually won several ribbons and trophies for this. He planned on showing his cows at 2 fairs during the time of today's case. It is said after his parents' divorce, Scott was relied upon more and more to sort of guide, and help the family. And the worse things got, the more Scott was relied upon by his family. It is said especially by his mother, Kay. He was even the one who had helped his mother apply for that grant to update the facilities on the farm in order to make operations more efficient. Scott attended Riverside High School in DeGraff, and as a senior was poised to graduate. Superintendent of Riverside Local Schools, Bernadette Bernie Pockmeyer, said of Scott, quote, "He was consistent from the first day he came to school until the last time we saw him. He was friendly, he was polite, a good student, not an honor student, just average. Quiet, but very, very polite. Great manners. He was one of those kids who would call you by name." She described Scott as a clean-cut boy who wanted to farm and fit right in at school. Quote, "He was a farmer at heart. He worked the land." She said farming was Scott's greatest passion. Quote, "That was his life. That's what he planned to do when he graduated." Scott had actually graduated from the school's vocational agricultural program that they had. And it was this program where, students took their regular classes in the morning and then worked on the school's home farm in the afternoon, some sometimes staying well past the time school got out. In the 6 years that Scott had attended the Riverside schools, he had only a single item in his discipline file, a one-time detention for tardiness. Wow, big deal, right? That was the only mark in his record, was one tardiness. That's it. Or one instance of tardiness, I should say. Scott was also a member of the First United Methodist Church, per family tradition, and was a member of the Liberty Livestock 4-H Club and Riverside FFA, formerly Future Farmers of America chapter. Through the FFA, Scott judged dairy cattle along his longtime friend, Brett Davidson, who was a year younger. Brett said of his friend Scott, quote, "I've never seen him lose his temper around the cows. He was always one of those kids that would go with the flow." Scott entered competitions, some even with Stacy and his mother Kay, and this was according to longtime agricultural teacher Tim Lydon, or maybe it's Lydon. He taught at Scott's high school. He said, quote, "Mom and Scott and his sister, they all went as a team and showed their animals. I've been there when his grandparents were there to sort of show their support. Stacy also did 4-H activities and had many certificates, awards, and ribbons herself. And it was said she had a real gift with animals, so it seemed, even though the farming gene seemed to have skipped Kay, seemed like it was alive and well in Scott and Stacy. And though Scott and Stacy spent as much time as they wanted with their father and his family, much to Kay's disliking, in the fall of 2002, when Scott was only 16 years old, it was said he decided he didn't want to see his father anymore, and he was going to stop going to visit him. Stephen, Scott's stepfather, said he didn't know of any, emotional scars or anything like that Scott had with his biological father. He just said, quote, "He was so young then. He didn't talk about it much. He always seemed to be happy when we were there." Steve and Audrey were super crushed at this, but Audrey actually understood it pretty well. See, over at Kay's, Scott was given much more freedom, all right? Especially the older that he got. There was really no rules at Kay's home. Kay had allowed her children to party, to drink, do all that stuff, kind of being like the cool mom. Whereas, over at Steve and Audrey's, they were expected to go to bed at a certain time. They weren't allowed to drink or, party underage or any of that. So Audrey figured, that probably contributed to Scott not wanting to come over anymore. Plus, Steve and Audrey had 3 young boys of their own, so I'm sure it was way more chaotic over there as well, Plus, Kay did still trash talk Steve in front of her children, so that may have also had a cumulative impact, Trash talking his father for 16 years, Stacy still came to visit, though. That is, whenever Kay didn't actively sabotage it. But by late summer 2004, it was becoming obvious to Steve and Audrey that Stacy was obviously having some problems at home. It showed in her declining schoolwork and her behavior. She was indulging in alcohol and drugs. I think just marijuana, but still, Stacy's 14 at this time. Look, man, I smoke weed and, I'm, all about it, but I think, 14 is way too young to be doing that shit. In August of 2004, Stacy had called her father and said, quote, "Guess where I am? I'm in a semi with my new truck driver friend in Tennessee." And, when Steve asked her, are you with your mom? Stacy just said, quote, "No, I'm with a guy friend." And then the next time Steve saw Stacy, she begged him to not tell Kay about her phone call to him because Kay did not want Steve to know what Stacy had been up to. She begged her father, quote, "Please don't tell anyone I called you. Mom doesn't want you to know where I went." And I guess Stacy's visits with her father just continued to decline from there. So remember I said this earlier, in addition to every other weekend, Steve also had visitation every Wednesday, but more often than not, Stacy would just be unavailable when they'd come to pick her up. No one would answer the door, no one would answer their phone, and there really wasn't much more that they could do. One of the Shafer family's neighbors said all of the family drama going on and all the turmoil and all that stress had turned Scott from a polite young boy to an abrasive teenager. And for about a week and a half before the events of today's case, and right after breaking up with someone, Scott started dating upcoming sophomore, 14-year-old Paige Harshbarger, who Brett said was a, quote, "real popular girl at school." And Scott, quote, "really liked Paige." Paige was actually a close friend of Stacy's, and that's how she had met Scott. In fact, she and Stacy both played on the Riverside High School junior varsity softball team. Paige was a catcher, and Stacy was a pitcher. Now, Scott and Paige had actually known each other, practically their whole lives, because, they grew up together. And again, that small community where, everyone knows everyone, everyone's grown up with everyone, you know what I mean? Now, 2 days before the events of today's case, Scott actually went over to Paige's home to help out with some chores around the farm and the home while Paige's dad had been out of town. Martha Harshbarger, which was Paige's grandmother, was at the home when Scott arrived, and she said of Scott, quote, "He seemed like a decent young man." And now let's start getting into the real meat of the case here. So on Thursday, May 26th, 2005, Scott attended the senior awards ceremony at the high school with Kay, Stacy, and his grandparents. Bernadette said that Scott seemed happy and grateful, quote, "As all the rest of the kids there. I know he was looking forward to graduating." After the ceremony, the trio then picked up Paige and then went over to Nikki's home in DeGraff. Remember, Nikki was Audrey's daughter. Now, Kay had evidently spoken to Nikki about some issues regarding Stacy, and that night, Kay asked Nikki if she would ever be willing to take care of Stacy should anything happen to her. Kay evidently also told Nikki that Stacy was upset about something, and Kay wanted Nikki to talk to Stacy after the graduation ceremony on Sunday, but Kay never got the chance to tell Nikki what she thought Stacy might be upset about. So on Saturday night, the eve before graduation, on May 28th, 2005, there was a party held at the high school for the entire 50-student class. Scott, Stacy, and some of his friends attended this party, but Scott left early. The party had grown way larger than just the 50 seniors that were going to graduate. So, it was getting a little too big for Scott's liking. So he invited a couple of his friends over to his house for a more small, quiet gathering. Stacy left the party with her brother, Brett, and Paige, and 19-year-old Megan Karus, who was graduating with Scott. Megan's family actually rented some property from Brett, so that was how they knew each other. Megan was to start work the following Tuesday at the Ameristop Shell Station on Ohio 235 in DeGraff. Her hiring manager, Ashley Copeland, said, quote, "She seemed like a good girl. I knew she wanted to go to college." In the fall, Megan was actually going to attend the local college, Bluffton College, on a full-ride scholarship. She actually wore a Bluffton sweatshirt to the party that night. Her friend, Delia Comer, said that Megan was an outstanding athlete and a basketball player who was quiet but, quote, "real funny once you got to know her." So all in all, attending the party at Scott's house was Scott, his girlfriend Paige, Brett, Stacy, Megan, a friend named Andrew Denny who would show up later, Kay, and Kay's then boyfriend, Jason Southerly. So that was all at the party that night. That is everyone who showed up to the Shafer residence to kind of chill and have a more laid-back night the evening before graduation. Brett would later comment that Scott, quote, "acted fine during the party." Quote, "He was joking around just like the rest of us. They talked about, school, farming, friends, classmates, just usual talk, just going back and forth, all while hanging out, shooting pool, and watching, quote, some movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. I played pool with him for I don't know how many hours, and he just acted himself." Scott did not really partake in any alcohol or anything at the party, and though Brett would later say there was no drinking at all at the party, there was drinking going on, but Scott didn't really partake. Brett said Scott, quote, "didn't have a clue what he was going to do after graduation, but was likely going to stay on and help on the family farm." Around midnight, Nikki called Stacy from a payphone at a gas station. She wanted to see how the party was, quote, shaking out. Nikki and her boyfriend Jeff did not attend the party that night because they were going to be at the graduation the next day. They had instead gone to a racetrack in nearby Waynesfield. Stacy told her stepsister that things were going well. She told Nikki that Gary, her grandfather, had agreed to do the milking so that everyone could kind of stay up and enjoy the evening a little bit. Nikki said Stacy to her didn't sound drunk, like she wasn't slurring her words or anything like that, and everything seemed, normal, fine, and happy, and she's like, "all right, see you tomorrow," and, hung up. Megan called her friend Delia from the party around 2 a.m. Quote, "She wanted me to come over and play games. They were just hanging out and goofing around." Finally, the party wound down, and Kay's boyfriend, Jason, finally left around 3:30 a.m. After the festivities ended, multiple people ended up staying at the Shafer residence. Scott and Paige slept in his room. Kay slept in her own room. Stacy and Andrew slept in her room, while Brett and Megan both slept downstairs in the living room / den area. Megan slept on the love seat, and Brett slept on the couch. Brett awoke around 6 a.m. after only lying down at 4 a.m. and decided to head home in order to get a head start on the morning farm chores that he was going to have to do. His family was going to go to a baseball game later that day, so he knew that they were going to have to do their chores bright and early before they could go. Man, do you remember being a teenager, being able to drink and only get 2 hours of sleep and then just be fine the next day? Oh man, I miss those days. I can't even do a glass of wine without just getting sleepy. Andrew also woke up and left the home early while everyone else was asleep. And then let's get into the event of today's case. So shortly after Brett left, on the morning he and Megan were set to graduate, on Sunday, May 29th, 2005, Scott, who was 18 years old, got up, put on a pair of jeans, and walked the quarter to half a mile to his grandparents' farmhouse. Their farmhouses ran along this 2-lane state highway road, Ohio 47, and it is when he gets to his grandparents' home that Scott would begin a gruesome murder spree. So according to investigators, Scott entered his grandparents' home and shot both of them with a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. And this was as they were up and about making their morning breakfast in the kitchen. Sharyl, who was 66 years old, had been beside her husband helping make breakfast when Scott shot her once in the back of the neck at close range. She was also hit in the face by a bullet that may have been a ricochet. And Gary, who was 67 years old, was said to have been making food when Scott came up behind him with the rifle, loosely placed it against his grandfather's neck, and fired 3 times. 2 shots in the right side, 1 in the left, killing him. Scott then walked back home, where he then methodically went room by room, shooting Megan, who was 19, his sister Stacy, who was 15, his mother Kay, who was only 37, and his girlfriend Paige, who was 14, who were all asleep when Scott killed them. Then, after he had massacred everyone in the home, Scott then turned the rifle off himself and killed himself. Now, miraculously, guys, get this, miraculously, Stacy did not instantly die when her brother had shot her in the neck. She regained consciousness as she lay in her bed, wondering if she just experienced a vivid dream. You know that feeling when you're first waking up and you're like, what the hell? That was kind of, where her mind was at. But as she transitioned to full alertness, she was fully aware of the pain all of a sudden she was experiencing, She was feeling immense pain in her face. She realized her eyes were awfully swollen, almost swollen shut. And the first thing that came to her mind was, I gotta find my mom. She managed to get out of bed and stumble out of her bedroom and managed to make her way to her mother's bedroom. She tried very hard to shake Kay awake, but she just lay there. And feeling dizzy, Stacy steadied herself and very, very slowly and methodically managed to make her way downstairs. And once there, she went into the kitchen. She drifted out of consciousness, and sometime later, when she kind of came back from her blackout or whatever, she managed to find her cell phone. She fumbled with the flip top, dialed a few times, I think different people, before she managed to get a hold of Nikki, who ended up answering very groggily. This was pretty early in the morning. Nikki and Jeff had had a late night. So yeah, she kind of answered the phone, kind of annoyed, what's going on? Now, Stacy had to repeat help a few times because, it was hard for her to talk. Nikki was waking up from a dead sleep. So it took Stacy a couple of tries to ask Nikki for help. But finally, she managed to say, quote, "Please hurry. My mom's been beaten up and I can't wake her." Nikki, Jeff, and their children quickly got in their car and they drove the approximately 20-minute drive to the Shafer residence. Once there, telling the kids to stay in the car, Nikki and Jeff made their way into the home. They immediately stepped into the kitchen where, evidence of the party was still clearly there, dishes piled up, empty beer bottles and trash laying about. You know how it is after a party's been dismissed for the night. In addition to the trash, however, there was a large red stain on large sections of the kitchen linoleum, and flies could be heard buzzing around. They looked over when the downstairs bathroom door opened, and out stumbled Stacy. They saw she was spattered with blood. Her face was completely swollen and bruised. She stumbled into a chair in the kitchen, and Jeff ordered Nikki to call 911 as he went through the house to check on Kay and Scott. Nikki ended up speaking with emergency services dispatcher Don Hubbard with the Logan County Sheriff's Office, who received the call at 10:35 a.m. Other sources said the call came in at 10:46 a.m., but either way, around, 10:30, 10:45. And she just said, quote, "My sister just called me and said her mom and her had been beaten up, and her mom isn't waking up. My stepsister's covered in blood. She looks like she was badly beaten up." Dawn then, asked for the address, and that's when Nikki stumbled. She had never really known Kay's physical address. It's just, let's go to Kay's home, So she was stumbling with that. And as she was stumbling and bumbling, I don't know the house number, that's when she heard Jeff shout from upstairs that she needed to get upstairs quickly. While still on the phone, Nikki rushed up the stairs. As Stacy stayed behind in the kitchen, Nikki met Jeff at the entrance of Kay's bedroom. And when they looked inside, it looked like Kay was sleeping in her bed. Jeff, tentatively nudged her, No response, nothing. He then crept into the room and felt for a pulse, and there wasn't one. And Nikki, who had followed Jeff into the room a little, like behind him, and remember, was still on the phone, then told Dawn, quote, "She looks dead. Stacy's mom looks dead. I can't wake her mom up. I can't feel a pulse." Once again, Dawn asked for the address, saying like, "Can you go check a mailbox?" Like, trying to, because, this is a lot. Can you imagine walking into this, guys? Like, are you comprehending everything I'm saying? Like, yeah, so I can imagine, like, the shock that Nikki was in, sort of like, what do I do? Where do I, you know what I mean? So, Dawn, because she's a dispatcher and that's their job, was trying to like, "Hey, honey, can you go out and look at a mailbox? Like, I need an address. I need an address." Nikki told Jeff, like, "Go look at the mailbox. We need an address." And they both backed out of Kay's room. But instead, Jeff signaled to Nikki that, like, "Hey, we should check the other bedrooms, And one behind the other, they went into Scott's bedroom and were horrified, of course, to come across Scott and Paige's bodies. Moments later, Dawn just heard on the phone, quote, "Oh my God, Scott, the son, my stepbrother, and his girlfriend are dead too." And, Dawn asked, like, what? Because, Nikki is like, shouting this, just like, oh my God, like probably saying it really fast. So Dawn was like, like what? And Nikki responded, quote, "I found Sheri Kay's son and his girlfriend. Oh my God." And, Dawn was trying to press for more info from Nikki, who was still, in a state of shock, just repeating like, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," like, I mean, I feel like that's what I would do, dude. Like, actually, I don't know. I think I would just kind of sit there and just sort of freeze and stare for a few seconds. I honestly think that's how my brain would like manage, is like, my brain would definitely be like, error 404, not found, don't know what to do. Like, I can't even imagine stumbling into the scene. And on top of that, like, I can't imagine stumbling into the scene, like, even without being related, you know what I mean? Can you imagine just stumbling onto a massacre? I can't imagine it being, people people that you consider family. I hope to God I never have to find anything like that. Finally, Nikki was able to sputter to Dawn, quote, "Sheri Kay's son and his girlfriend are beat up too." And, Dawn repeated what Nikki had told her, trying to get the information, trying to verify. And Nikki responded in part, quote, "I've got to get off the phone and call my mother." But, Dawn reminded her, like, "Honey, I need the address. Like, you need to give me the address first." And Nikki just said, like, in part, this is the only part that Dawn was able to comprehend, quote, "Is the only one awake?" And Dawn repeated, like, "One awake?" And Nikki said, quote, "Yes, my stepsister, Stacy." And when Dawn asked how many people had been beaten up, Nikki replied 4. Again, Dawn asked for the address, and Nikki sent Jeff outside to look at the mailbox. And the mailbox was actually across that 2-lane highway road that ran along the farmhouses, which was super bizarre to me. But yeah, so he had to dash across the highway, get the mailbox number, and just as he dashed inside the house, just as he opened the door and was about to run up and give Nikki the address, that's when he noticed Megan on the love seat. And then it was at that exact moment, because I think she had heard, Jeff coming in, that Nikki came downstairs and was about to yell at him, like, "Give me the address." But she noticed Jeff's, eyesight, and she followed it and then screamed into the phone, quote, "Oh my God, there's one in the living room. There's another one on the couch." She ended up giving the address and just said, quote, "Please hurry. Everyone's been beaten up." Authorities rushed to the home within minutes. The sheriff's office was a little more than a mile from the residence. Deputy Wyrick was the deputy on call who received the initial dispatch call, and he drove out to the farmhouse to meet Nikki and Jeff. Jeff was out front waiting for the deputy while Nikki and Stacy were in the kitchen. Stacy, miraculously, was still awake and still somewhat coherent. According to Deputy Wyrick's report, Stacy appeared, quote, "dazed with a large amount of blood on her neck and face." But before the deputy could even ask Stacy any questions, Jeff had immediately kind of like grabbed the deputy and was like, no, you need to go upstairs, man. Like, they were full-blown shock and panic. Understandably. So Jeff, took the deputy and said, quote, "There are more upstairs. You need to check the ones upstairs." When upstairs, Jeff led the deputy into Kay's bedroom, where the deputy stated he saw, quote, "a white female lying supine in the bed. She was covered up with a blanket neatly tucked under her chin. Her right hand was laying halfway above her head with the palm up and open, and that she appeared, quote, gray and blue and not breathing." He then was led into Stacy's bedroom. He noted all of like the blood everywhere. Her sheets and pillow were just splattered with it. He then went into Scott's room and found, quote, "a white male laying on the bed with a long rifle in his right hand with his thumb on the trigger." He reported Scott, quote, "was laying supine on the bed with his feet and legs below the knees off of the end of the bed." He reported then seeing, quote, "a white female laying on the bed on her right side, facing the wall of that bedroom, and, quote, she appeared to be gray, blue and unresponsive, that Scott had a large amount of blood on his face, that there was blood on the bed and a blood spatter mark on the wall at about the height of Paige's waist. Scott lay on his back and did not have shoes or a shirt on, while Paige was completely dressed and neatly covered with a blanket pulled up to her neck. Wyrick radioed for backup, but just as he got downstairs, Jeff then whirled him this way. He was like, nope, there's another one. And that's where they found Megan, who, quote, also appeared to be blue, gray, with no sign of responsiveness, and had what appeared to be swelling to the left side of her face. Waiting for backup, Wyrick then tried to interview Stacy, but all she managed to get out was her name and age. But that was all she managed to get out before she kind of glazed over and became more incoherent. He still tried pressing for more info from her, though, and he kept asking her, like, do you know who did this? And Stacy said no. Wyrick's supervisor, Sergeant Dodds, arrived to secure the scene, as did the paramedics, who concluded everyone except for Stacy was DOA. In the paramedic Jim Collins report, he said that when he found Scott, quote, we found a male victim with a rifle within arm's reach of him, which is a pretty big, significant difference between Wyrick's report, right? Believe me, that's just one of many, many questions that will crop up in this case. More medical help arrived. They stabilized Stacy and then rushed her via helicopter to Ohio State University Medical Center located in Columbus, 45 minutes away. Stacy had 2 gunshot wounds to her face and neck, a shattered neck vertebra, and significant blood loss. Additionally, the main artery to her brain had been severed, and the gunshot wounds had damaged her vocal cords. So meanwhile, as, Stacy was being taken care of at the hospital, investigators started taking stock of the crime scene. Detective John Stout arrived on scene, and do remember that name. He plays a very significant part in this case. So he arrived on scene, and in his report, he stated what he saw when he first entered. Quote, there was blood on the kitchen table and floor. More blood splatters could be seen in the dining room. He noted that there was a recliner with a footrest that was open in the dining room. A blanket had been rolled off to the left side of it, and a large amount of blood was on top of the left armrest. He found the body of Megan on the love seat, laying on her left side, her backside, which was against the back of the love seat. She was covered with a multicolored comforter, her head and right hand exposed. Her hand had blood stains, and blood oozed from her right ear. She had been shot in the right side of her neck. They found a .22 caliber shell casing on the floor near the north wall of the living room, discovered even more blood stains on the reclining chair, which was near the west wall, and found more blood on a sleeping bag that was lying on the chair as well. Blood also covered the floor between the chair and an end table, where they found a bloody tissue on top of a magazine rack that was attached to the end table. And as they moved throughout the house, they noticed blood drops and smeared handprints on the stairwell, which was probably from Stacy, slowly, methodically making her way downstairs. Kay was found in her bed, on her back, blankets pulled up to her chin, just in the hairline of her right temple. They found what they believed to be a contact gunshot wound. Blood ran from her nose, mouth, and left ear. And there was also dried blood on her neck and both of her hands. Another .22 caliber casing was found on the floor next to a work boot by the foot of the bed. They also saw footwear impressions deposited in the dust on the floor next to the bed's headboard. Moving into Stacy's bedroom, Detective Stout found blood stains on the bed, sheets, floor, a chest of drawers, on a TV screen, along with 2 more of the casings they had already found. One on the bed and another on the floor on the side of the bed. There was a blood-stained Ohio State hoodie found on the bed, and it looked to have bullet holes in it, and when Stout picked it up to examine it, yet another shell casing fell from it. They also found a bloody handprint on the face of a large antique mirror that had been hanging on the wall. Again, probably from Stacy. They then moved on to the last room and found Scott in his bedroom, his legs dangling off of the foot of his bed, his feet on the floor. He was dressed only in bloodstained jeans, and according to Stout's report, Scott's right hand was on the rifle, his right thumb through the trigger guard and on the trigger. Yeah, already some weird discrepancies that are cropping up. The tip of the barrel rested on Scott's right shoulder, his left hand was on his left hip, and he had blood coming from both his mouth and nose. There were bloodstains on both of his hands, and on a pair of work boots that were on the floor, that were at the foot of the bed. Paige was laying in the same bed. She was looking propped up, but slumped against the wall, shot in her left temple. She lay on her right side, facing the wall, and was covered by an orange blanket, with her head and right hand exposed. bruised. She had blood coming from her nose, mouth, and left ear, and investigators noticed bloodstains on her right hand and on the wall near her right hand. Stout reported 2 distinct bloodstains, and they were on the north wall, and he found 3 casings in the bedroom. One on the floor near the foot of the bed, a second underneath Scott's body, and a third wrapped in the bottom edge of a curtain. He then went outside and, interviewed Nikki about everything, but, for whatever reason, never got an official written statement from Nikki. More police arrived, including Logan County Sheriff Mike Henry, who was Detective Stout's supervisor, Detective Sergeant Jeff Cooper, Logan County Prosecutor Gerald Heaton, and a Deputy County Coroner. Now, pretty much right away, all the authorities were 99.9% sure that Scott was the shooter. They didn't believe Stacy's statement about not knowing who it was. They thought that, she was just mistaken. I mean, after all, she'd been shot in, the neck and face and stuff, and, there was stuff with her brain, so they were like, she doesn't really know what she's talking about. Sergeant Cooper dispatched an officer to go consult with Stacy's doctors at the hospital in Columbus, dispatched others to block off certain routes to, sort of secure the crime scene and all that, and ordered Stout and his partner, who was still so new that he was on probation, Detective Mike Brugler, to conduct interviews. They started with Nikki, who reiterated what had happened, starting with Stacy's phone call. And then she also told the police a little bit of what Stacy had managed to tell her as they were waiting for deputies to arrive. She repeated Stacy's insistence that it was a stranger and repeated what her stepsister had told her. Quote, "There was an older guy with gray hair standing there with a gun, and I tried to push the gun out of the way." That's what Stacy had told her. And like we just discussed, Stout was already dismissing this statement of Stacy's. Nikki told the detectives about the family dynamics, about how Scott didn't really get along with his father or her mother, but she thought one of Kay's boyfriends, Dave Cusick, might be a good place to start. Now, as Stout was interviewing Nikki, Steve and Audrey arrived on scene, and after they were told of the situation, Steve then asked them about, what about Kay's parents, Gary and Cheryl? And, Stout was I thought they were out of town, and Steve cut him off and said, quote, "No, they're back. If they're not here, then something's wrong." Stout then turned to Deputy Kohler and told him, hey, go over to the other Shafer residence and, knock and see, what the situation is there. And if no one answers, force your way in. And 10 minutes later, Kohler had radioed to Stout and told him that there were 2 more bodies that had been discovered. Stout and Brugler then drove over to that residence to assess that scene. So upon entering the kitchen, investigators found Cheryl lying face down on the kitchen floor, fully dressed and in slippers. There was some mail underneath her. Gary was draped over his wife's midsection, fully dressed with barn boots on. He was face down with a large pool of blood surrounding his head. His glasses had fallen in between his legs, and 3 rounds of ammunition within 12 inches of each other lay all around Gary's left boot. Stout reported, quote, "There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table where it appeared people had been sitting. On both sides there were glasses of juice with bowls and medication ready to be taken. Breakfast interrupted. 4 pieces of bread were lying on top of the toaster. The bread was buttered. Next to the sink, a knife stuck out from a tub of butter, eggs ready to be placed into a skillet." And as authorities worked the crime scene, more and more people gathered around. It's a small local area. Everyone knows everyone. Yeah, this spread really fast. Everyone had something to say about the family. Again, everyone knows everyone. And there were just so many people coming and be like, "Oh, I knew them. I knew about this, blah, blah, blah." That police were like, all right, there's so many of you. We need you to come down to the sheriff's office and sit down in an interview. We can't do this here on scene and all that. There's just too much. So some of the police then headed back to the office to start conducting interviews as people were going to come in. Now, when they got there, Dave Cusick was already there. He said he had spent the evening with his girlfriend of 18 years, whom he lived with, and had no clue about Dave's affair with Kay. Dave and Kay had actually met 3 years prior through a mutual friend while buying and selling cattle. Kay had actually hired Dave as a farmhand for a short period of time, and to also do some remodeling on her home. He said, quote, "Sheri Kay was a close family friend, as were our children. Our relationship evolved after spending so much time together. Plus, she was sexy. We always got along together. We never had the slightest of any disagreements." Dave said he last saw Kay the Friday before she was killed, on the evening of May 27th around 6 p.m. He said they had sat at her kitchen table, shared a beer, talked, made out a little, and after he had left... Get this. After he had left, she had called him to remind him to buy flowers for his girlfriend's mother's funeral. Yeah, Dave here is a real peach. Detectives then asked Dave about Scott. Kind of wanted to see, what do you think about Scott Moody? Dave said that he thought Scott was backward, but he didn't know of any problems between Scott and his mother or anything like that. He verified that there were shotguns in the Shafer home, and he knew this because him and his family had gone deer hunting with them. But he told them he never heard about Scott, Kay, or anyone else owning a .22 caliber rifle. And he told them that he himself personally had never seen a .22 caliber rifle in the Shafer residence. He said he had called Kay that Sunday morning around 10:30, 11 a.m. And it was to remind her that like, hey, I can't come to Scott's graduation. Remember, I have to go to a funeral. And he told police, quote, Stacy answered the phone, but she was incoherent. He said he could tell like something was off and wrong, but he just thought, they partied late last night. Maybe she's like still drunk or hungover or something. And he didn't really think much of it. He said he could also hear in the background that Stacy was talking to somebody else, probably on her own cell phone. So it made it difficult to really like understand what she was saying. I believe when Stacy went to go try to wake up her mother, she had grabbed her mother's cell phone as well, which is why, when Dave called Kay's cell phone, Stacy was the one who answered. Dave said he hung up and then tried calling Gary, but he couldn't get through there either. So then he called Stacy's cell phone number. And, he was going to ask her for Kay. He said Stacy told him in a raspy voice that her mother was in bed. Quote, I hung up again with Stacy and I kept trying to call Sheri Kay's cell phone. Finally, Nikki's boyfriend answered, real panicky, and told me it was bad and I might want to come up as soon as possible. He said that was actually when the sheriff's office contacted him to come in. Quote, hey, I still had no idea what happened. Me and my wife were at a friend's cookout Saturday night in New Martinsburg from around 6 until 1 or 2 in the morning. We were together the entire time. After we left the cookout, we went straight home and went to bed. And the drive from New Martinsburg to Kay's residence was about an hour and 15 minutes. Dave was released shortly after, and Kay's other boyfriend, Jason Southerly, then contacted police himself to tell what he knew. So Jason, who was 25, said that about a year ago, he had been involved with Misty Martin, who was John Martin's daughter. If you remember, John Martin lived with Kay for a while. Now, though things didn't work out with Kay and John, apparently they still stayed like in touch. It wasn't like any animosity, I guess, when they broke up, so they still talked on and off. And Misty even rented one of the farmhouses that was rented out by the Shafer family. So Jason, ended up dating Misty, even moving in with her for a while. And that's how he quickly became friends with their landlords, Gary and Cheryl. And through that, that's how, he ended up meeting Kay and Scott and Stacy. And that's how he ended up knowing everyone. Now, Jason, who I said is 25 years old, said that he thought Stacy, who remember is 15, was, quote, cute. And often he created excuses to drop by Kay's home so he could talk to Stacy. Yeah. Disgusting. Now, eventually, Jason and Misty broke up, and when the police asked Jason to reiterate that Saturday night/Sunday morning, he said Kay had called him that Saturday evening, and she wanted to know if, he wanted to go to dinner with her. So around 5:30 p.m., he and Kay went to the Red Lobster in Lima, which was about 30 miles away, and afterwards, they went to Walmart to get a graduation card for Scott, and while they were shopping, that was when they got a call. It was Scott, and he was informing his mother that he had invited a few people over to the house. Jason told police that Kay had the reputation of being the cool mom and, told him like she used to buy the kids beer, let him hang out, but wouldn't let anyone drive home drunk or anything like that. Now, Jason said when him and Kay showed up to the house, the party was in full motion. And Scott said like, hey, we're kind of hungry. And so that's when Jason and Kay left to go get Wendy's for everybody. They then stopped for a case of beer to bring to the party because the alcohol was running low. And Jason verified everyone who was there at the party, even if he didn't know them by name, he could describe them and police could suss out who he meant. He went on to say, quote, there were no problems at the party that night. It was kind of a last minute thing. Scott's official graduation party wasn't scheduled until June 18th. Everyone was just kicked back and having a good time. We were all having a good time riding the four-wheeler out back. He said Scott took the vehicle out first, and several others then, rode on it. They took turns. He said Paige kept wanting him, not Scott, to take her on rides on the four-wheeler. He said he asked Scott, like, hey, do you mind this? And Scott was like, nah, I don't care. I don't mind. He said when the four-wheeler got low on fuel, that's when they put it away and kind of moved everything inside. He talked about the alcohol that was consumed at the party and said, quote, as far as I know, Sheri Kay didn't have a drop. I had 2 beers at supper. I think I saw Scott take 2 swigs out of his girlfriend's beer. He thought Paige was really drunk, though. Quote, she had slurred speech and all that. He thought maybe Stacy had gotten a little drunk as well, but not nearly to the degree that Paige had been drunk. He said that when they had returned earlier with the Wendy's, like the food and then the case of beer, Brett was already passed out on the kitchen floor. Quote, he must have got up and moved to the couch at some point because he was on the couch when I left. He told police that he stayed at the party until around 3 a.m. and he himself got home at around 3:30. He said he slept until noon, got up, had breakfast, and then that was when he got a phone call telling him the news. He said that he did sleep with Kay that night in her bed, and I wasn't sure if they slept together or not, but he did say that on his way out, as he was passing the living room, he saw Megan pass out on the love seat and Brett passed out on the couch. He had seen Stacy and Andrew going up to her room earlier, and then he saw Scott and Paige go to his. And when he left the house, he assumed that they were all, like, passed out. Quote, the other guy that showed up to be with Stacy was still with her in her bedroom, and that was Andrew. Remember Andrew Denny? We'll get a little bit more about him in the next video. And then, unprompted, and without any push whatsoever, Jason then told police, quote, the reason I originally started wandering over to Sheri Kay's house was because of Stacy. I wanted to date Stacy. 25, going after a 15-year-old. Fucking disgusting, you pedo creep. And when Stacy refused him, that's when he decided to mess around with Kay. What trash, dude. Like, what a scumbag. Detectives then asked Jason about any guns in the home, and he said he himself had only seen 2 handguns. When he was still living with Misty, he said that he saw Kay give John those 2 handguns, and this was while she was going through her divorce with Steve. Quote, Sheri Kay was concerned that her then husband, Steve Moody, might come in and shoot her in her sleep. He also knew that Gary Shafer did have shotguns in his home, but that was it as far as he knew. The police then asked Jason, do you know why Scott would go on this murderous rampage? You know, trying to get, like, what's your assessment of Scott? And Jason hesitated before saying, quote, personally, no. But he did say that Kay had once told him that Scott could blow up at any time, and that he had a very hot temper, just like his father. But Jason said at the party, Scott seemed pretty excited about graduating, although he thought Paige may have made him a little bit upset. Quote, she was a lot to handle. She was really drunk. They asked Jason if Scott was drunk. Quote, no, Scott told me he did not want to walk down the aisle at graduation with a hangover. They asked Jason if there were any drugs at the party, and he said no, and that when he and Kay had first gotten home returning from Red Lobster, the kids had gotten a bottle of vodka out. Quote, the kids ran out of beer, so we went into town and got them a case of Bud Light from the Oasis. Jason also told police that he was well aware of the affair Kay had with Dave. At this point, they had been having an affair for about 1.5 years, and Jason said, quote, I've never met the guy, although he scares me. He's into drugs big time. He's probably a dealer. This guy's pretty rough. He has another woman that he just had a baby with. In fact, he just started accusing Sheri Kay of messing around with other people. Sometimes I worried for her safety. After Jason was interviewed, Stephen Wolf then came down to be interviewed. He was very anxious to talk to authorities, and he was kind of nervous, like what his last interaction with his ex-wife could be, you know, so he wanted to come down and kind of set everything straight. He had last spoken with Kay about 4 months prior, and it was regarding property and money she still owed him from their divorce. Remember, we mentioned that earlier. He said he was owed about $15,000 in cash and property, and that when they had last spoken, they had agreed to start settling things. He said that Saturday night, he drove past the 2 Shafer residences. It was his normal route home. He wasn't like being stalkery or anything. That was just his normal route home. It was around 12:15, 12:30 a.m., and he said he drove past the residences with his girlfriend. They had just seen a late night movie, so they were on their way home. He said there was 1 or 2 lights on at Gary and Cheryl's place, but all the lights were on at Kay's. Stephen said the next morning, he heard his police scanner come on and request a med flight from Kay's location, her address. I guess he had a police scanner that he liked to monitor or something. I thought aren't those illegal? I don't know. But anyway, like, he had a police scanner that he liked to monitor, and that's when he heard, you know, oh, we need a med flight, and then when he heard, you know, Kay's address, he decided to call his friend John Martin. Everyone knows everyone. He wanted to know if, like, him or Misty knew what was going on. I think they lived closer as well, and he's like, dudes, like, what's going on? John said that he had received a call earlier from Stacy, like an hour or 2 ago, but he didn't think there were any problems. The detectives then asked Stephen what he knew of the murders. And they also wanted to know, as Scott's stepfather, what kind of an opinion did he have of his stepson? That's what they really wanted to know. Stephen said, quote, he's not the person I thought would flip their lid. I thought it would be Gary. I do know that Scott was doing something drug-wise. I know when I lived there, Scott would be fine one day and not the next. he would get belligerent, mouthy, and aggressive. Grandpa Gary acted that same way, but worse. I was always watching my back when I lived there. He said he only knew about 2 handguns that Kay had, but he never saw a .22 rifle, and said, quote, Grandpa Gary had all the guns. He was also adamant that Gary and Sharyl were very anal retentive about keeping their house all locked up, and I don't think he really liked the angle that the interview was going. I don't think he liked the nature of the questions regarding Scott, because he then went on to tell detectives just how close his own children had been with Scott and Stacy even after the divorce with Kay. He told them that he didn't believe Scott, quote, could have that kind of rage in him. They asked Stephen about his decision to stop seeing his biological father, and Stephen just said, quote, you know how teenagers are. There wasn't any real animosity there. Detectives then asked Stephen about his divorce with Kay and what happened there, and reluctantly, Stephen, said that they split due to the financial difficulties, which he blamed in part on Kay's parents. Quote, we were struggling with trying to keep her parents afloat. We shared the bills for the farm, but it got to the point where we were paying more than they were. Stephen also said that he never understood the family's difficulties. Kay's family had been successfully raising dairy cattle in Logan County for like 150 years. Quote, Sherry and I made a good living when we first had a herd, but the milk prices went down and things got a little tighter. He reiterated the back taxes that Kay's parents had neglected to pay since 1997, how the farm and buildings had kind of, fallen into disrepair and all that, but talked about, how the farm was due for a comeback. He said the family had headed off foreclosure, renegotiated their tax debt, and he brushed off Scott's motive to be stress and feeling overwhelmed by the family responsibility to take over the farm, because that seemed to be like the first motive they were thinking is oh, maybe he snapped under the pressure of having to handle the family and the family farm and stuff. But Stephen disputed that. He said Scott wasn't worried about the future and that Scott had worked the ground that past spring and planted feed crops for the family's growing herd of cattle. Quote, at the time they had 22 cows and they had 20 or 30 more that were going to freshen, give birth, in the next 2 or 3 months. He also said the family disagreement between Kay and her parents and how all that was going down wouldn't have been enough of a motive for Scott to do this. He said family disagreements about the farm, quote, had been a thing for at least 30 years. But Stephen wasn't even really concerned with Scott's motive. The one question that Stephen had with authorities was, where did this .22 rifle come from? He didn't recognize it, said there had never been a rifle in the home as long as him and Kay were together. He had never seen it. He also said that Scott only had a passing interest in hunting, shooting guns wasn't his favorite thing, and he wanted to know where the rifle came from and who it belonged to. That was Stephen's question for the authorities. It's no, I don't want to tell you about rehashing family history. Where did this gun come from? Stephen really did not believe that his stepson could have done this, former stepson could have done this, and he was really concerned about where this .22 rifle had come from. And that is where we will end part 1 of this case. Oh yes, and there's so many questions coming forth. So next week we will go into more of the investigation. There's more interviews being conducted. We will get Stacy's point of view and what happened and what she said. So yeah, what do y'all think so far? Isn't this wild? This is wild, right? I mean, I was reading the newspaper articles that were coming out when this first went down, and everyone in the town, everyone who knew Scott was scratching their head because they were he had no warning signs whatsoever. Remember, Columbine hadn't happened that long ago. School shootings and all that were a big news topic. And so there was all this talk, right, of the warning signs of, kids who would do this. And this left everyone, including nationwide professionals, scratching their head because Scott did not exhibit any of the normal behaviors that usually accompany, shooters like this. Yeah, there's a lot to get into. There's so many questions. I mean, don't you already have several questions already from what I've told you so far? So many weird questions and weird things that happen in this case. We'll get all into it next week. Thank you so much again to Smash the Bug for pointing me in the direction of this case. And remember, just in case, you're curious, this is the book that I got a bulk information from. Got some information from newspapers and other sources, but a lot of the nitty-gritty details were from this book, Saving Stacy, The Untold Story of the Moody Massacre. And I'm really sorry if there's a lot of background noise. I'm filming this outside my normal time. There's so many fucking cars cars and loud crap around here. There's a huge car culture here, and I can't stand it. I hate car culture. So sorry. Do my best to mitigate, but you know, we do what we gotta do, right? Work with what you got. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope I will see you next week as we continue getting into this case. There's so much to get into. So until next week, I hope you have a fantastic week. I hope things are wonderful and peachy for you. Remember, as you're out there, don't be a dick. Leave a little sparkle wherever you go. And I will see you next Tuesday. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Bye-bye.